We have a couple of other welcomes on our announcements list today. I'm very happy to announce that the City Club has a new research director, Nancy Kirkinen. Where are you, Nancy? Well, she'll be here. She's going to manage the club's research and standing committee activities. We're very lucky to have her. She has a varied background ranging from research science to the Oregon Women's Political Caucus to managing Bob Shoemaker's 1990 re-election campaign. With all that variety, we're bound to be well served. Welcome to Nancy Kirkinen, who I know she's here. Also, we'd like to welcome the students and faculty members from Merrillhurst College who are beginning today this term's class, Discourses in Public Affairs. As you know, this is a course at Merrillhurst based on City Club programs and discussions. And they are here today. We welcome them also. A couple of other announcements before we have our program. Next Friday, April 12th, William Donaldson, Chairman and CEO of the New York Stock Exchange, will speak on Market of the 90s, Meeting the Global Challenge. When Donaldson became head of the nation's largest stock exchange earlier this year, he promised to reinvigorate the exchange, which had lost market share to foreign, domestic, and regional markets in recent years. He has said he plans to fight growing competition at home and abroad and to bring back investors scared away by the '87 crash. Please note that program will be at the Hilton. This is one of your challenges, to remember where the programs are going to be. Now, as we have mentioned before recently, the Governor's Office of Executive Appointments, headed by City Club member Phyllis Oster, is seeking forward-thinking leaders to serve on a wide variety of state boards and commissions. Now, there are currently 194 boards and commissions to which Governor Barbara Roberts makes appointments. Current openings exist on the Governor's Council on Alcohol and Drug Abuse, the Children and Youth Services Commission, and the Advisory Council on Podiatry. Applications are available in the club office through Executive Director Nancy Hedin or by calling Phyllis Oster, 378-3123 in Salem. And we will be continuing to announce upcoming vacancies. The third session this year of our leadership course, Pathways to Leadership, will begin May 2nd, run through June 13th. This section of this very successful class is now filled to capacity, but if you would like to be placed on a first-come, first-served basis for the next class, please call Nancy Hedin at City Club. She'll notify you when the next class is scheduled. For those of you who may not have thoroughly read your bulletin lately, City Club now has 33 roving ambassadors in the community inviting people to join City Club, which, as you know, is an organization of concerned, active citizens. Please do your part. Invite someone to join today. Our program today is just about what it was announced in your bulletin. We have a just minor change. The subject is almost the same, but just a little changed. The topic is Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the Elements of Success. The substitute who was announced last week for General Johnson is, well, should I say in orbit. He really was not able to land. And so we are very, very fortunate that a member of his staff preceded him to Portland yesterday. So we actually are going to have the speech, but it will be delivered by Major Jim Bates, a Portlander. Our board host today is Peter Baer, who is treasurer of the City Club and a member of the Board of Governors and also loan officer for National Mortgage Company. And he, of course, will have the privilege of asking the first question of our speaker. The second question will be asked by Lee Hess, member of the City Club's Science and High-Tech Standing Committee. Following his question, as is our custom, we will open the meeting up to questions from City Club members only. And as is also our tradition, we want questions to be questions and not statements. Preference is given to questions from the microphone. Although there are forms on your table for written questions, which will be taken as time permits, please hold up your questions after the speech so staff can pick them up. Okay, I think that's announcements, unless somebody has another one. Although Desert Storm was a closely watched on CNN and successful 6-week military operation, there remain many questions about what happened there and what implications there are for the U.S. military and the Gulf region. One thing is clear. Public support for the military in the United States today is extraordinarily high. In keeping with City Club tradition, we are pleased to have as our guest an expert in the military to discuss the recent war. Major Jim Bates is the Chief of Operations with the Office of Public Affairs for Military Airlift Command. A native of Portland, currently stationed at Scott Air Force Base, Illinois, he is responsible for informing the public on the activities of the Military Airlift Command in Desert Shield and any other operation. Major Bates is a graduate of the University of Portland, where as an ROTC cadet, he was a student of State Representative Mike Burton, who also happens to be here today. After entering the Air Force in 1976, he served in Strategic Air Command as a missile combat crew commander until 1982, when he entered the public affairs field. As a special assistant to General H.T. Johnson, the Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Transportation Command and Military Airlift Command, Major Bates has been instrumental in articulating the logistical activities of those commands to the public and the media. Please join me in welcoming Major Bates to the City Club of Portland.
Thank you very much. I have to say that I'm honored to be speaking to a platform as prestigious as the City Club. I certainly never thought I would have that opportunity, but I'm delighted to have that. It's also good to be back in Portland. I thought I would dry out in Illinois, but I'm pleased to see that it can be adequately revived. General Johnson sends his deep regrets that he can't be here today. As you know, Desert Shield, or Desert Storm, was not just one, but actually 3 wars. There was the 100 Hours Ground War we're all familiar with. There was the 1,000-hour or so air war. But actually, the war that began before that and is going on right now is the logistics war that started back in August and will probably continue for about a year. Now, we're engaged right now in a massive redeployment of troops and equipment from the region. And that's good news for the folks at home, but it's bad news for you because General Johnson is involved in that and can't be here. I have had an opportunity to receive from him a variety of the things that he would like to talk with you about today, and I would like to pass that on. Also wanted to point out that, as Gretchen mentioned, Major General Willis was intending to be here today, and although the weather broke for the Atlantis launch, it didn't break for his C-21, so he is now on his way back. Well, in the past 8 months, we've witnessed an impressive demonstration of the capabilities of America's armed forces. They're, without question, the best trained and best equipped forces in the world, but they're also a new type of force. And what I'd like to talk about this afternoon is 6 elements of success, 6 things that were critical to the success in the Desert Shield operation. These same elements of success, I believe, are going to be the foundation of America's armed forces for the future. One thing some of you may recall, Pete, especially you may recall about the difference in the armed forces in the past. A unique aspect of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine and Coast Guard personnel is that each and every one of them is a volunteer. They're in uniform because they raised their right hand. They volunteered to be in America's armed forces. Well, in 1973, the American public, not the military, decided to have an all-volunteer force. And I know there were a lot of questions early on about the validity of the concept, But this all-volunteer force has proved capable of attracting the talented and well-educated men and women needed for our high-tech force. And these same young men and women proved their mettle under fire in Grenada and Panama, and they proved it again in the Arabian Peninsula. And it's an interesting thing that to a greater extent now than ever before, this is a total force. It's a force made up not solely of active duty military, but also of guardsmen and reservists. The total force, I mentioned, is a very cost-effective method of maintaining the military capability and American needs. And I think this will be true for the future. In the Military Airlift Command, for instance, 1/2 of our air crews and maintenance personnel, 2/3 of our aerial port personnel, and about 90% of our aeromedical evacuation personnel are in the reserve and the guard. But this reserve and guard differs a lot from previous generations. They're well equipped, they're well trained, they're highly motivated. And prior to the activation of the reserve and guard, more than 5,000 men and women volunteered for duty in Military Airlift Command. And I would mention that in Portland, there were a number of volunteers within the ranks of the Guard and Reserve units here. But when the history of Desert Shield and Desert Storm is finally written down, America's Reserve and Guard forces will deserve a great deal of the credit for America's success. Quite simply, we could not have done this without them. We had another key element besides the all-volunteer force and the fact that it was a total force. We saw that this particular force was a joint force. Just a little over a year ago in Operation Just Cause, we saw a demonstration of how effectively our forces can work together. All the organizations within the Department of Defense now are playing from a common sheet of music, and that's called the Goldwater-Nichols Act. This was a piece of legislation that created a structure so that an entire theater of operations would be under the complex and complete control of a single commander, and that commander reports directly to the Secretary of Defense through the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The days of a field commander reporting to 4 or 5 different bosses is now a matter for the historians. It's no longer a problem. That's been a long time coming. But we're now reaping the benefits of a unified command. General Schwarzkopf is the single commander of all the U.S. forces in the Gulf. Thus, the problems that commanders used to have of reporting to multiple echelons of military bureaucracy has been done away with. The problems of command, control, planning, coordination have been eliminated. Well, these first 3 factors, that is, the all-volunteer force, the total force, and the jointness of our forces, were critical to our success in the Persian Gulf crisis. And I think they'll continue to be so for the future defensive activities. But they've not received the publicity that you may have seen attributed to 3 additional elements that were also critical for our successes there. These 3 elements, technology, readiness, and global reach, will also serve as the foundation for America's defense forces in the 1990s. It's kind of interesting. These elements gained widespread attention when President Bush delivered an address to the Aspen Institute on August 2nd. It's ironically the very day that Saddam Hussein's tanks rolled into Kuwait. And I think historians will surely note the additional irony that it was America's readiness and global reach that allowed us to deter further aggression of Saddam Hussein. And when the war began, our technological superiority allowed us to bring the 4th largest military force in the world to its knees in a matter of weeks. During the past 7.5 months, the sophisticated capabilities of our air and land and naval forces were clearly demonstrated. These capabilities not only provided us with an overwhelming advantage over our adversary, they also limited casualties, both military and civilian casualties on both sides. When we look at history, it's clear that Americans don't like war. And I was I guess I should say I was delighted to see that some people expressing their opinion downstairs about that. And this may sound strange coming from someone standing before you like this, but I welcome that. That can't happen in a lot of countries in the world. That can only happen here. And that's why I'm wearing this uniform, is to allow that to happen. But Americans as a nation don't like war. And when we go to great lengths to avoid it, but when we're left without options, the American public insists that we fight in a manner that will end the conflict quickly, decisively, and as humanely as possible. Well, technology has brought about incredible changes in our military capabilities. A target that required hundreds of B-17s and thousands of crew members in 1941, and I might add, would involve thousands of collateral or civilian casualties, innocent people that happen to be nearby, today can be taken out by a single F-117 and one pilot and one bomb. Aside from the precision accuracy, the F-117 is also virtually undetectable, even in a high-threat environment. Our Arab allies call it Shaba, the ghost. That's why it was tasked with attacking 31% of all the targets during the first 24 hours of the air war, even though the F-117 represented only about 2% of the airplanes in the theater. But America's technology advantages were not limited just to the airplanes. The Army's M1A1 tanks totally dominated the battlefield. Their speed allowed them to outmaneuver the Iraqis, and their thermal imaging systems allowed them to see through the smoke and also at night. Many Iraqi tank commanders reported that they had been defeated by a force they hadn't seen until after their own tanks had been destroyed. There was a rather dramatic report I heard of a young Iraqi officer who was in a column of tanks, and they were fleeing north after dark, and he surrendered. And he was asked why he surrendered. And he said, "I saw the tank to my left destroyed. I saw the tank to my right destroyed. We couldn't see what was hitting us. We had no idea what was going on. We got out of our tank, and 3 seconds later it was destroyed." Well, technology saves American lives. That's not, it's not just that we want to have equipment that performs well. We want to have equipment that will accomplish the mission, but do so with the minimal risk to the lives of our men and women in uniform. The best example came from the U.S. Navy. Our ships fired 299 cruise missiles with a success rate of 85%. This technology allowed us to attack targets more than 250 high-priority targets deep inside Iraq without risking a single American life. Well, virtually all aspects of Desert Storm demonstrated America's technological advantage. However, none were more dramatic than those in the air campaign. And we must bear in mind that on 14 January, the Iraqis had the 7th largest air force in the world, which included many highly sophisticated combat airplanes. And I believe had is the operative word. In fact, the Iraqi Air Force recently announced their motto, which was, "We fly more international flights out of Baghdad than any other carrier." But our total domination in the air came from no single system, but from a combination of air superiority fighters, deep interdiction, and close air support assets, along with the tankers and airborne command and control assets to support them. This was a joint operation. And again, it's a big change from the way we've done business in the past. This air armada was composed of Air Force, Navy, Marine, and Army air assets from the U.S. and coalition forces. Each day, a single air tasking order orchestrated the most sophisticated and fast-paced air campaign in history. Well, we've enjoyed technological superiority for decades, and it's something that we want to maintain for the years ahead. But readiness is something we've had to work on extensively during the past decade. Our success in this effort was demonstrated last August when President Bush ordered the movement of U.S. forces to Saudi Arabia. Within hours of the President's order, our forces began to arrive on the Arabian Peninsula. The first airplane I have a certain parochial pride in reporting was a C-141 from Military Airlift Command containing some command and control elements. A few hours later, the F-15 fighters began arriving. At the same time the F-15s were arriving, a C-141 with the flight line security aspects, that is, the security policemen and all their vehicles, touched down. And another hour later, all the maintenance forces for the first TAC fighter wing came by C-141. So that, think of this, in a matter of a few hours, an entire tactical fighter wing was arrayed and ready to go. Within less than 96 hours after receiving the order to go, we had 5 fighter squadrons, an airborne warning and control system unit flying missions over Saudi, and while less than 5% of our pilots had combat experience prior to Desert Storm, the extensive training that they had had enabled them to perform like seasoned warriors. The investments that we've made in readiness during the past decade was money well spent. The training exercises in Nevada and the California desert, the stocks of spare parts that we allowed America to respond to this crisis with a strong and credible force. I personally find it interesting that there were several systems or several concepts to aid readiness that had not been tried before. For instance, we had the maritime preposition ships at anchor in the Indian Ocean. We had afloat prepositioning ships that carried spare parts and supplies as well as tanks for the 1st Marine Expeditionary Brigade. These were ships that were, some people might say, tying up valuable supplies because they were prepositioned, they weren't being used, and they had been there for years. But when they were needed, they were able to respond very quickly. Now that was an expensive investment, but I think the cost of them not being there would have been far higher. The final element that I wanted to discuss this afternoon is global reach, certainly a key element in the Persian Gulf crisis. As President Bush noted, no nation on earth has the capability to deploy the size force that we have deployed. In fact, no nation could even have contemplated such a deployment. Well, it hasn't always been that way, and I wanted to read something kind of interesting about the Spanish-American War, the first time that we really tried to do this. We mobilized troops and tried to move them through Tampa, Florida to Cuba on short notice. The results of inadequate transportation were disastrous. They included jammed rail lines for 500 miles all the way from Tampa to Charleston, South Carolina, insufficient wagons to unload the trains, not enough ships, disorganized ship loadings which caused loss of unit integrity, and the drowning of over 10% of the Army's pack animals because ship captains refused to offload cargo on Cuban shores. And once the troops finally did get ashore, it took days to reassemble and begin all over. That didn't happen this time. This massive deployment was the first major test of America's newest unified command, the U.S. Transportation Command. For the first time in a major contingency, our entire defense transportation system was under the command of a single manager. As many of you may know, this system is highly dependent on the commercial sector. But our air and rail, maritime, port, and trucking industries all lean forward to meet the demands of the massive deployment. Never before in history has any nation airlifted as many tons, as many miles. At the height of our initial surge, more than 124 strategic airlifters were landing in the desert each day. That's one airplane every 11 minutes. America's civil air carriers played an integral role in this massive airlift. Immediately after the airlift flow began, several airlines offered their support. The first civilian mission was flown on August 10th. And the voluntary participation grew to 40 aircraft. However, the magnitude of the operation soon exceeded our capabilities, and on August 17th, General Johnson called up Stage 1 of the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, or CRAF. Now, I don't know how many people have heard of the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. It's been in existence more than 38 years. It's never been used. It's a partnership between DoD and the civil air carriers to provide airlift in a contingency when it's needed. And it's a great system because when it's not needed, it doesn't cost anything. In order to provide the same capability, if the military had to have the airplanes and operate them, the cost of the airplanes involved alone would be more than $50 billion. On January 17th, Secretary Cheney activated Craft Stage 2, which made available a total of 117 long-range international aircraft. This historic step was taken to ensure that we had the capability to meet the sustainment requirements during Desert Storm. Since the beginning of Desert Storm, we have generated more than 19,000 airlift missions, including active duty, reserve, guard, and commercial airlifters. These missions carried more than 500,000 passengers and delivered more than 1 billion pounds of cargo. 1 billion pounds is a little difficult to comprehend. Let me explain it this way. 1 billion pounds worth of mid-sized cars, like let's say Dodge Daytonas, would line up bumper to bumper, would stretch from Portland to Phoenix. It's a lot of cars. Airlift provided the global reach for the majority of our personnel, and it also provided the immediate response. But the vast majority of the equipment and supplies, close to 85% of all the tonnage, was carried by sea lift. We used more than 200 ships to transport more than 6 million measurement tons of cargo. Growing up in Portland, I can remember seeing the mothball fleet, or what it's officially known as, the Ready Reserve Fleet. Portland had 5 Ready Reserve Fleet ships, of which 4 were called up. Also, looking down there, I would be able to see the steel bridge. And there is an interesting thing on December 31st. We had literally a steel bridge that reached all the way to Saudi Arabia. We had 132 ships en route to Saudi Arabia and 44 returning to the United States. That's one ship every 50 miles from Savannah, Georgia, to the Persian Gulf. While most of our major military installations have their own airfields or are close to commercial airfields, it's not the case for seaports. Therefore, in the U.S., we used more than 14,000 rail cars and 23,000 trucks to deliver supplies and equipment to the ports. For this transportation, we relied almost exclusively on the commercial sector, and I'm proud to report that they did exceedingly well. It was nothing less than outstanding. Let me give you an example. The 101st Airborne Division out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, was one unit that General Schwarzkopf wanted most urgently. In a 5-day period, we used 1,174 trucks from 27 different companies to move the 101st to the port at Jacksonville, Florida, without a single late arrival. Our air, sea, rail, and truck and port operations have all been managed and coordinated by the men and women of the United States Transportation Command. This massive and highly complex operation, composed of assets from the uniformed services, active duty, reserve, and guard, and the commercial sector, has been an unqualified success. No nation in history has ever moved so much, so far, and so fast. It's safe to say that U.S. Transcom has passed its first major test, and that it will be a key player in the future of America's defense organization. To maintain this capability for global reach, we will, however, need to make some adjustments and modifications and modernizations. In our Sea Lift program, we need to focus our efforts on the readiness of our Ready Reserve Fleet. We must increase the number of roll-on, roll-off ships in the fleet, that is, those that can have vehicles directly driven onto them rather than relying on cranes and heavy equipment at the ports. On the airlift side of the house, our C-141s are rapidly approaching the end of their service life. In fact, I believe there is one at Norton that will shortly pass the 40,000 hour point. We measure the age of airplanes in equivalent hours, or the hours on the airframe. And Essentially, they are old. They're getting to the point where it's very expensive to maintain them. One thing I'm pleased to report is that the successor to the C-141, the C-17, the first prototype has been rolled out and should fly this summer. The Air Force Chief of Staff, General Merrill McPeak, has made it clear that the C-17 is one of the Air Force's top acquisition programs for the 1990s. But the support of the C-17 isn't limited to the Air Force. General Johnson is fond of saying, I don't need the C-17. The Army needs the C-17. The Marine Corps needs the C-17. There are a lot of people that need it besides the Air Force. The C-17 has strong support from the services, but also from Congress. It's not just an airlifter for the Air Force, it's an airlifter for America. It's almost certainly an airlifter that General Schwarzkopf could have appreciated. During the first 12 days of the airlift, the C-17 would have allowed us to deliver an additional 12 fighter squadrons and 2 infantry brigades. And I might also add, had we used the C-17, we could have delivered everything he called for 10 days quicker. And in a wartime scenario, had Saddam not paused and waited, 10 days could have meant the difference between deterrence and defeat. Well, when I began, I said I'd discuss the 6 critical elements involved in Desert Shield. But in reality, there's a 7th, and that's the support of the American public. At no time in the past 5 decades have we seen such unanimous support for our men and women in uniform. This support must continue when the troops come home. The yellow ribbons will come down, and they should. We should give them to our returning men and women. They belong to them. They've earned them. But we must also remember that when the victory parades have ended, their professionalism and sacrifices must not be rewarded with pink slips. There are a lot of returning guardsmen and reservists that have served honorably. And in talking with some of the folks out at the base, I know that the support of the employers here is very high, and I'm very glad to see that. Well, as we scale down the size of our forces, we must do it in a prudent, responsible manner, a manner that will ensure that we continue to meet America's security needs, and meet them in a manner that will honor America's commitment to our all-volunteer force. Well, I'm just a major, but I am personally proud of the role that America is playing in this historic and unprecedented airlift. As a nation, it was a team effort. Our active duty, reserve, and guard forces, equipped with American technology that is the envy of every military in the world, supported by the American people, is the team that led the way in turning the mother of all battles into the mother of all defeats. It was a team effort, and one that made us all proud to be Americans. I'll leave you with the words of Dr. Bob Arnett. You may be familiar with him. He's a medical correspondent for CBS News. And he aired a broadcast recently. He was interviewed on experiences in Desert Shield. And he told this story, and I think it says a lot about us, about America. He says, I flew on a U.S. Air Force C-130 medical evacuation flight. We departed Jubail Air Force Base, or Air Base in Saudi Arabia, and flew north. We landed not at an air base. In fact, there wasn't even a runway. We just landed on the desert sand near a battlefield, next to a mobile Army surgical hospital. It was nighttime, it was raining, and the winds were gusty. Certainly not an easy task for the pilots. The job for those in the back of the plane was no less difficult. They loaded on 50 wounded soldiers, some in critical condition. One had just come from brain surgery. Another was unable to breathe on his own. A technician had to manually blow air into his lungs for the entire flight back. All of the doctors, nurses, and technicians performed heroically. Many of the wounded would not have survived had it not been for their professional care and courage. Here they were, flying into a battle area in terrible weather, landing on nothing more than hard-packed sand, risking their lives to save others. Perhaps the most amazing aspect of all, however, was that all 50 wounded soldiers were Iraqis. As I stood back and watched, I realized that America is not only a powerful nation, it is also a good nation. I'm very proud to be here today to represent the men and women of America's Armed Forces, and on behalf of them, to thank you for your support.
Thank you, Major Bates. Now, I'd like to repeat that after our first two planned questions, our microphones will be open to City Club members only, and we are looking for questions and not statements. The first question then will be from Pete Baer from the Board of Governors.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you, Major Bates. And I think you did a very good job of substituting today. The parallel between Vietnam and what went on in Saudi Arabia, I think, was put somewhat into disrepute as the events of the war in the Mideast unfolded. But it's difficult for me as a Vietnam vet not to draw some comparison. And basically, I guess what my question would be, we had a high degree of military success in both wars, and yet we had quite different outcomes in the Vietnam conflict and in the Mideast. My question would be, what elements of success were involved in the political or policy-making aspect of Desert Shield and the interplay between the politicians on one hand and the military on the other that contributed to the success that we had there?
Thank you for that question. Well, I think basically there are two aspects that contributed to that success. One of them I already mentioned, the Goldwater-Nichols Act, the fact that you have one commander, and that limits the levels or the layers of management down to essentially one person who is placed in charge of all the forces in the theater of operation. And as a result, there is tremendous coordination, tremendous flexibility. And I don't think we saw that in Vietnam to the same extent that we did in this. But you mentioned the other aspect, the political aspect. And I think it would primarily be that in this particular war, we did not have people 10,000 miles away from the front who were planning targets on a daily basis. It was not managed from Washington to the same extent that Vietnam was. In fact, the leadership decision of the president was to appoint the best people to do the job and then to let them do the job. And I think to a great extent, that's what we attribute the differences between the way the events unfolded in Desert Shield and the way they did in Vietnam. Now, obviously, there are other factors, and I would defer to a historian to answer any of the details of how that would go. But
The Science and High Tech has the privilege of the second question. Mr. Hess?
Major, just a simple statistical question. What's the current best estimate of the number of Iraqi military casualties from the war? And if you could, how do they break down between those incurred during the air war and those incurred during the ground war?
boy. And I have to thank you for that question, too. One of the things that public affairs officers get to practice as a skill is catching spears. This is one of those questions that I'm ill-equipped to answer because first of all, I don't have those statistics with me, and second of all, I'm not sure what has been said about that in the past. I know that surely every effort was made to minimize the casualties on that. The fact that we sent some very sophisticated, very expensive type of aircraft and precision systems that we didn't need to, instead of doing massive bombardments or any other sort of indiscriminate or area application of force. Instead, we chose to use very precise types of targeting systems and types of delivery systems. And I guess some people might refer back to the question of how many Americans it takes to change a light bulb. The answer is only one, but he does it from 30 miles away using a precision laser-guided system, and it costs $800,000. But the point of doing that, of course, is to limit the number of casualties so that you take out one target precisely without a lot of collateral damage. And I'm afraid that's the best tap dancing I can give on that particular issue. We can talk about it afterwards, and I'll see if I can get some numbers.
Questions from the members, and please state your name.
Thank you. I'm Alston Leach, City Club member. Major, I hope you like the question that I will pose to you. We're all extremely interested about the quick settlement of great problems across the country, in another country, with their problems brought quickly to an end. What can this force of skills, of people, of euphoria be done now to address our inner problems under proper constitutional guidelines so that we can address the inner concerns that we all have that are happening here? In other words, a force for overseas becomes a force for our domestic problems. Thank you.
Well, yes, I like that question. But that's a good question, because the experiences that the men and women that have served in Desert Shield have had are profoundly moving. They have seen people that have been brutalized. I think that a person, well, no sane person can observe what has gone over there and not feel compassion for the people that are over there and not be appreciative of what we have here. But I think what happens out of a process like this is you get some changes in people. People that have been complacent, that have been the recipients of the greatest democracy on earth, that have been the beneficiaries of this great economic system, all of a sudden realize that everything isn't wonderful. And the result is that I think the caliber of people that are coming out of the desert are the people that, whether they stay in the military or whether they serve as volunteers in other organizations, I think that energy and that compassion will be brought to bear on some of these problems. And I know that, well, my boss just got back from Saudi Arabia night before last. And he was quite a bit different from when he left. He had a totally different perspective on some of the issues of human suffering.
Questions?
Peggy Bird, City Club member. Major, let's see if we can get back to the Spears. There are a couple of military analysts, including Anthony Cordesman, who disagree somewhat with your analysis of particularly two areas. One is sea lift, and the other is the readiness of the reserve. Let me give you some of what they said and see if you'd like to comment on it. That the sea lift worked because we had so much time, and that in fact, in most other circumstances, we're very ill prepared with sea lift. And as far as the reserves are concerned, roundout units did not join their companies in the desert because they were not prepared, and reserve units that got there hadn't trained on the equipment that they were to use. And that in fact shows that even though under those circumstances they did a tremendous job, that in fact they're probably not as trained as they should be, and we haven't quite gotten them up to snuff. Would you like to comment on those two areas, please?
First of all, regarding the sea lift issue, that is a very serious and very real concern. Let's face it, when you take a World War II vintage ship, place it in a preserve status or I can't think of the nautical term, but essentially, harking back to my early days here, the mothball fleet, you place it in a storage status. It takes time to bring those back up. Anybody that has not driven their car all winter and turns the key, or better still, the lawnmower, try to start that for the first time in the spring, yes, it does take time. And these are real concerns. There are a number of things that we can do about that, and some of those are being looked at in terms of the acquisition of more sea lift type ships. Certainly that is going to receive much more interest than it has in the past. Getting to the other aspect of the question on the reserve units, yes, that is a fact. There were some round-out units that did not join up with their units because of deficiencies in training or whatever the situation may be. On the whole, they did very well. The reservists and the guardsmen that were called up performed very well. I can really speak primarily for the airlift side of the house in talking about how well the guardsmen and reservists that were called up have done. I know, for instance, one concept that we have with the reserves in Military Airlift Command is the idea of associate wings. An associate wing is simply a wing, a military airlift wing, without any airplanes. What that means is that those people in the wing fly the airplanes that belong to their partner active duty wing. And they do that day in, day out. Consequently, they do get the practice and the experience. As far as some of the other types of units, well, I can't really talk to some of the aspects of the Army and the other services, but on the whole, they did very well.
Mary McWilliams, City Club member. Would you comment on to what degree women in the military actually engaged in combat, and what are the implications for these women's experience or inexperience in combat for their leadership potential in the military?
Well, first on women who are engaged in combat, I don't have statistics on how many were actively involved in combat. Certainly they were not intentionally so, and that's a function of legislation rather than policy, military policy. Women served very honorably and very effectively in Desert Shield in a variety of specialties. I think one of the classic stories is an F-15 pilot, and when he got up to refuel over Saudi Arabia, well actually northern Saudi Arabia, when he got up to refuel from the tanker, he discovered his wife was flying the tanker. That's one of the things that is characteristic of the military today, that there are more and more women involved in a variety of specialties, I should say non-traditional specialties within the military. Well, as a matter of fact, as was mentioned earlier, I came out of a Strategic Air Command background in the Minuteman weapon system. And that was, at the time I was in it, there were no women in Minuteman. I don't know why any of them would want to get into Minuteman, actually. I don't know why anybody would anyway, but that's beside the point. That man at the head table there was the one that helped coerce me to go into missiles. But in any event, there are now women pulling duties as missile combat crew commanders, both, well, in Minuteman. And I would say if we entrust to them 50 nuclear missiles and the capability to launch them on command, we can certainly entrust women with any job. It's not a question of whether they are should be treated any different or whether there are any differences in capabilities. They're Air Force people. I don't know. The distinction is only a legal one for certain specialties. Other than that, they're people. They do the job.
Andrew Wheeler. I wonder, I think there are many of us here who wish that there could be a United Nations peacekeeping force, and that perhaps we wouldn't be or consider ourselves the hired gun in upcoming situations, and there will be upcoming situations. How do you think of that? How do you think about the United Nations as relating to all of this, and a possible peacekeeping army where we wouldn't be the main player necessarily. It may not be as efficient, but there may be some virtue in not being the hired gun.
To a certain extent, NATO represents that type of a situation where the majority of the troops in NATO come from countries like Turkey. We supply a lot of the technology, or I shouldn't say a lot, I mean, we supply a certain percentage of the military forces, and the other NATO allies provide comparable hardware. The role of the United Nations, well, I have been really pleased to see how the United Nations has gone from being sort of a, what shall we say, a policy-making body that has been of some interest but not relevant to the situations in the world, to one that is much more effective than in the past. And I would hope that we would continue in that direction, that the UN would continue to exercise its authority and would, as you say, be involved in more peacekeeping type operations that would involve the broad spectrum of military support from all the countries. Clearly what we saw with the coalition forces is an example of that. While it is true we provided the major portion of those forces, that was a function of the players involved. So I think it would be great.
Dan Goldie, member. There are many people who think that we are now in the process, having won the war brilliantly, losing the peace, because of the fact that Saddam Hussein was left with enough military armor and aircraft to slaughter the Kurds and the Shiites. My question to you is this: given the military superiority you referred to, wouldn't it have been possible, and isn't it possible, for us to have taken out the helicopter gunships just as easily as we took out the fixed-wing aircraft?
Clearly it is possible. In fact, one rather interesting statistic was there was a crew of an F-15 that bombed a helicopter in flight. Can you imagine trying to explain that when you got back to base, that you bombed a helicopter? Nevertheless, given the capabilities that we have, yes, we could have, and I suspect that it was a function of the way the operation was going. And I'm sorry, I am sorry that we were, what shall I say, that was not one of our objectives, because, again, anybody looking at what's happening now in Iraq sees such unbridled evil in action and can't help but be moved by it. Nevertheless, our objective, or the UN objective, was to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. And having done that, we have achieved that objective. Should the UN come up with other things that we would need to do, how we would participate in that, I don't know. We may be involved further. But I think the key thing is that the reason that we did not, our objectives were clear, and we met those objectives. Sir.
Press, Dr. Ed Press, member of the City Club, and Air Force veteran from 42. Dan Gold gave half of my question, and the question primarily was, why the distinction between a fixed wing and a helicopter? I mean, if you're going to stop the airplanes from getting in there, why not stop the helicopters? Can you give me some comment on why they made a distinction between the fixed wing and the helicopter?
The fixed wing aircraft that Saddam possessed, the majority of them were combat aircraft. That is, they would have the capability to deliver ordnance, and they were very clearly a combat asset. Having taken out the roads and the bridges in order to prevent his resupply of the forces in Kuwait, we assumed, in a sense of compassion, that the helicopters would be vital for airlifting necessary supplies and medical things and essentially dealing with the results of the war.
We knew that the helicopters were gunships, didn't we? I mean, what about that? Do you have any comment on that, or are you constrained to not comment on it? I mean, sure, they could help. They could make medical evacuation, but they also had all these cannons on them. You care to comment? Or I can understand if you want to pass it.
I don't. Let's see. Do they receive this channel in St. Louis?
Forget it.
It's a good question. It's a legitimate question, and I'm just not really equipped to answer it.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Any written questions that we haven't addressed? Corleen.
Yes, Corleen Kraft, member of the club. You made me think about the issue when you mentioned that the two pilots were men and wife. And it occurred to me that perhaps for the first time, this is a war where we've seen husbands and wives go to war together and leave the children behind. As a culture, we promote the institution of family. So my question is the military going to do anything about this as a matter of policy in the future, or is this something that will have to be legislated? And when I say the something, in my mind, is that this is not the kind of process that I think should occur. Mm-hmm. So the something would be to eliminate both the father and mother from going.
Well, two parts to the answer. First of all, every Air Force member is required to have a written plan in their personnel file on what they will do when they're deployed. Particularly if both members are deployed, you have to have written down the process that you'll be using to look after your kids. That can be having them stay with relatives, that can be having them stay with friends, however that may be. And having 4, I would think lovely, but I'm biased, children of my own, I can appreciate where you're coming from, and it's a terrible thing when the parents are drawn off. But that's something that, on the one hand, we want to ensure that the kids are looked after. We want to ensure that the parents are obligated to make some sort of arrangements for the kids. But at the same time, we're caught in the dilemma, or maybe not caught is the right word, but we have the situation where we don't want to restrict people from either pursuing their military career objectives or from fulfilling vitally needed military specialties. And if we say, well, you're a combat communications specialist with this particular radio or teletype system, but you can't go because your wife or your husband are also going, that makes it tremendously more complicated to try to find somebody to backfill to that position, and then you have to consider, well, does this person also have, so it gets to be a very difficult thing. And I think that what we have done is probably the best or the only thing we could do under the circumstances, and that is require that there be a system for looking after the children.
Thank you again very much, Major Bates, for pinch hitting on very short notice. Next week, the stock exchange at the Hilton. We are adjourned.